Hey guys. So this game is going to be against Scott Appel, who's one of the best players that's never talked about as being one of the best players. He's probably been in the top 10 or 15 players for at least a decade at this point. Now, this game's a few years old, and because of that, it's going to have a few decisions that may not be applicable today. I'm going to try and skip over those a little bit, but if you see something that maybe you would do something a little bit different, it's probably because the dictionary has been updated since then, so there's going to be a play or two where maybe some of the other options you could consider just aren't words yet. That being said, I think there's a lot of very interesting technical decisions, and both of us are adjusting, maybe not ideally, but we're adjusting to each other, which is something that you don't see in a lot of games nowadays. So I'm first CDEENQT. Now you can play decent out of this rack. I think that's a decent play. I decided to exchange. Even among the exchanges, there's a few reasonable ones. You can exchange just the Q, you can exchange QD or QC. Now, I exchanged QC, kept DEENT. I think it's a reasonable play. I did it because I don't really want to be in a very volatile situation. I think that exchanging Q is probably the best play, per se, in a vacuum. You know, it hits a bunch of bingos, it hits enacted, enticed, credent, stuff like that, scented. But when it misses, it's actually pretty bad. Whereas if you exchange two and you miss, you're generally going to be in a lot better shape. Being said, when I think about it a little bit more, a lot of people exchange one and they keep really, really strong racks all of the time. And because of that, a lot of people also respond by doing something a little bit too defensive. And CDEENT does really, really well against overly defensive exchanges. And I don't think that Scott gives me credit for having as wide a range on X1 as I actually do. I exchange one a lot. I think that a lot of people under-exchange one, and that you should actually do it pretty often with any rack that doesn't really have a lot of good options. I think that Scott puts me on S the vast majority of the time. When I don't have an S, he puts me on stuff like Entail or something like that, something really, really strong. I don't think that he gives me credit for having a really wide exchange one range. So for that reason, I think that exchanging one's probably good here. That being said, I don't think it's that big of a difference. Scott, AABENNP, and a few choices. He has Penna, he has Payan, he has Nab, and he decides to do something a little bit unorthodox and he plays Napa, and he plays it off-center. So first let me talk about why you would play off-center, and then talk about why this may or may not be a good idea in general, or in this particular situation. So one reason to play off-center is if you have something like a Z or an X, which is certainly what I thought that Scott was doing at the time. You'll definitely get a lot of overlaps and re-overlaps with those tiles, and because of that, it's a pretty decent option. Not really applicable here, but he does have the B. The B is going to overlap and re-overlap quite a bit, so it's a little bit reasonable here for that reason. The other reason is if you think that somebody has an extremely strong range, especially when it hits vowels, you don't really want to leave a vowel open in column H. And you don't really want to leave S hooks either. So if you open Napa at a more conventional location, you might get S-hooked and then they might hit a double word score. That being said, again, my exchange 2 range is really, really wide here. And I think that any top experts exchange 2 range is really wide here. It's one of the only cases where top players' ranges are actually wider than lower rated players' ranges are. So I don't think that's as much of an issue, and I think that if you actually want to avoid that, you should just exchange. You can exchange ban, by the way, you don't have to play it. So in this situation, he is right that I'm going to get PE down quite a bit, or that he's going to get some B options down quite a bit, but I really don't think it's worth it. I think you should just take the leave and try to bingo more often. BEN is really not a very good leave. BE doesn't go well together at all. B is not a very good tile, and you should just get rid of it whenever you can. So I probably prefer just nab here. I think playing long is also reasonable. I think it's pretty close. Also think the exchange is also reasonable given how strong my range is. When somebody has a really, really strong range, you actually want to lean towards exchanging a lot more often because you don't want to give them 8s to play through. You'll make a lot more bingos playable, and the bingos that play are often going to score a lot more. Even in the case of Napa, a lot of times you're going to get overlapped, and those bingos are going to score quite a bit and not leave that much back. So yeah, I probably prefer something a lot more conventional here, something like Nab or exchanging. And even like Penna I think is okay too. So I draw 2 U's and get a really, really ugly rack, and actually still have a lot of options. I have undo, I have tuned, I have nude, I have undo in another spot. I have Poodoo I could play. There's just a bunch of really decent options here, but nothing that really stands out. My decision here really comes down to what I think Scott has. And I thought that Scott was very Z heavy and very X heavy. I didn't think he had it all the time necessarily, but it doesn't really make that much sense to do what he's doing with. I didn't think it was too common because I was a little bit confused because Zap and Pax are both reasonable plays, and because of that, Z's and X don't really make that much sense. So I just got kind of confused. Figured maybe he had another N, didn't want to do that for some reason, but I think that this is a mistake. I think this is probably the biggest mistake I actually made this game now that I think about it a little bit more. But yeah, Toon does really good against Z's and X's. It doesn't do very well against the rest of his range. He has a lot of overlaps. If he has stuff like another P instead, then this is a really bad play, but I thought he'd do Papa instead, or he'd just do Nat, or just something else. I mean, there's just so many other options. So I made a decision on his range, and because of that, I made this play, and if I would have realized what his range actually was, I definitely would have made a different play. Anyway, Scott definitely won this exchange of plays, and got me to play something that was ultimately not very good. Scott has AABEHNO, so he's an R short of habanero. Again, a few choices here. He has Ba in another spot as well, and he has Bohea as well. I prefer Ba in the other spot. My range here is, yes, very wide, but there's just so little that you can actually do after Ba in the other spot. There's just so few scoring options. And my range is basically random here, and any play that I make on row 7 is going to open something pretty significant, with a rack that could take advantage. And it's not going to score very well either. There's no reason to believe I have an S. In fact, I almost never have an S after tuned. I think I get it. Ba does block the S hook, but I just don't have an S that often here. And even if I do have an S, my range isn't very good. I basically have a random rack. So I don't think it's really necessary to block the S hook at this point yet, especially since there's going to be S hooks in the future. And it just makes scoring so much more difficult. So for that reason, I prefer Ba in the other spot. I do get why Scott did this. I do think that there's value in closing the S hook both for next turn and for future turns, but I definitely prefer the other Ba here. So I draw pretty well. EFHMORU. These are the kinds of racks you really want on this kind of board because it's so scoring heavy and no one really has a good range here, so bingos are going to be pretty difficult. Not really a ton of options here. I end up playing Ref. I think the only real other alternative is Tofu here, and I don't really like doing that because there's no real point in keeping a really strong leaf here. The H and M are pretty good for this type of board anyway, and you're just not going to get a really good scoring spot no matter what you do. Hem is not going to be overlapped over Tofu. That's just not going to happen. He's going to play over there and probably not leave you any good scoring options anyway. And I'd just rather have the points right now. I need to wait until I get some sort of good rack that can actually open the board in some reasonable way, or bingo. And I don't think that sacrificing points is worth it. I think that you just need to take the points and go. Scott draws the J, AEIJNOT, and he plays Chitan. I would have liked to see Jiao here. I think it's a little bit better. I think that sacrificing the points is worth it because of the ret hook and the bot hook. I think that the T is useful. I think that you're going to get enough value out of ENT that it's definitely worth doing that. Even if it's a sacrifice of points, you don't really want to keep AI here. ENT is just a lot better, not just in general, but on this board. And I don't really like leaving the overlaps on row 11. I think that's really dangerous. Yeah, I prefer Jiao by just a trifle. I don't think it's that big of a difference, but I think it is a difference. AEHMNOU. I almost have Houseman. Not really a ton of choices here. I can play Hom, I can play How. And I'm choosing this mostly because I don't want to give too much back, and I think that this is the play that gets the least back. Scott's range is basically random again, and I don't want to make it too easy for him to score, and I think that this play makes it really difficult to score while giving me at least some underlap. I have the U, so I can play something like UM at the very least, and I also have UN plays, so I have something like Unmu or Unmet or something like that if I draw better tiles, and maybe even better depending on what I draw. TOO hook is much easier for me to use than a random rack, so I think that's a pretty standard and solid line. Scott has 80 IIIOX and exchanges. Now, he can play Taxi here. I think it's actually reasonable to do so. I'm not going to be able to use the opening too well. I often have something along row 12, or else I wouldn't have done that. So I think it's reasonable. I think it's pretty close. The X isn't really a good tile on this board either. I mean, he exchanges the X. That just goes to show you how bad the X is here. I think it's actually reasonable to exchange the X. I just don't think it's a very good tile on this particular board. You're not going to get a lot of X spots on future turns that often. You can exchange more tiles here as well. I'm not exactly sure what you should exchange here. It's pretty close. The D and the A are useful for row 11. So in that case, it's a case to keep the D especially the D and maybe the A. D is pretty close to average anyway, so it's probably a little bit better on this board, although not that much. Gets marginal, I think you can go either way with it. The A is the same way. The A just improves the lead slightly because of balance and because the A is a decent tile. It also fits, DA words also fit. Doesn't really matter one way or the other. I think you can go either way, and I think both options are perfectly fine. I have E, F, G, I, M, N, U, and really only two options. Both of them are on row 12, and both of them block the opening I just created. I don't really get anything good with the UN here. You can go with Emu. Emu makes it pretty difficult to overlap, but with UM, I want to keep the E here. It's a little bit better. I also don't really want to keep the row 13 options open. Tombs is not a word, so making all those U hooks, and I don't have a U hook that's any good. I'm not going to use UN, so it's mostly something only Scott gets to use. Ending up playing, I think it's perfectly reasonable. I think that Emu is also reasonable. I just prefer this by just a hair. Scott has ADKLSYY, and a few options here. You can play Day, he can play Alkid, or he can play Alki. Now, Alkid keeps the S for the hook, and he has the Y for the hook. Those are really two good tiles for that. I'm not sure it's that great, though, if you think about it a little bit more, because what is my range here? After Ref and How and I'm going to have a lot of S's. I wouldn't say I always have S's by any stretch of the imagination. I don't here, but I would guess that over half the time I have an S, and when I don't have an S, maybe another 15-20% of the time I have a blank. So even though you're keeping good tiles for that hook, I think that you're not going to get to use the hook that often, probably less than a third of the time. So I'm not really sure I like it for that reason. I do like getting rid of the D. The D is not a good tile with that leave. And I'm not really sure I like Alki either for the same reason, because the whole point of Alki is to play the D hook, but you're going to get hit by the S a lot. And delaying that one turn isn't really going to change that any. So I don't really like that either. I don't think it really makes any sense in this particular situation. I think it makes a lot more sense to go ahead and play Day. You have some underlaps. You have the Y for the underlap. You have stuff like Yak and Yak as potential overlap options. You also have the S, so if you want to put the S there, you can. It's a lot less dangerous. It's not really a good scoring option. And my options are going to be more bingo heavy, especially with the Ref hook, which I could have, and he certainly doesn't at this point. So Alki does have a lot of good immediate offensive options. I think it's better than Alki, but I definitely prefer Day here. I think it's just a lot better technically because of my range. I do end up having EFGIN here, which is pretty bad, but I think that that's a very low end of my range, and that my range is actually a lot stronger than this, especially after How and Ref preceding it. I have a lot of ERs, I have a lot of ERS type of leaves. So for that reason, I definitely prefer something like Day over Alkid. That being said, Alkid's a reasonable play, and you can't be afraid forever, and a decent percentage of the time Alkid is going to stay open, and he's going to get to hit me off of that pretty hard. E, F, G, I, and R, and I bingo. It's the only option here. There's no other bingos I can play. And Scott has C, E, N, S, T, X, Y, and really a bunch of options here. He ends up going with exec. He could play cent, he could play ex, he could play sex, all of which are reasonable. You really do want to close that opening. I have a random rack, but on the other hand, it's not that big of an opening here. It's really hard to use that for too many points as a scoring option, and the overlap's going to be difficult too. It's not that easy to overlap fingered. So I think cent is reasonable. If you do get the O, you get OX for 57, and there is some chance that it stays open. It's not that particularly good of a chance. I mean, there are certainly times when I'm overlap, and sometimes I'll get a big play over there, but it's just pretty rare. And a decent percent of the time I'll draw an S too at this point, and I'll get the Alkid hook for a bunch of points too. It's not like you're blocking by far the best scoring option by taking out the E. It may look like the best scoring option. It probably is by a hair, but it's not that good. In comparison, your X options there are much more good for you than the S options will be after exec next turn. So I think it's actually pretty close between that and cent. I don't really like EX, and I don't really like sex either. I don't think that either of those make any sense. You're playing defense when you're behind in both of those cases, and not really getting any good options immediately. But I think that exec and cent are both reasonable options. I think it's pretty close between the two. Scott goes with exec again. I think it's very reasonable. I draw very well. I draw satire plus E, and have two bingos. I have Airiest and I have Eateries. Now, a lot of people I think would play Airiest, and it does score 5 more points. I don't think this is actually close. I think that Eateries is best by a very large margin here. I'm going to have a lead after this play. I'm going to be up by almost 70. Scott's range is pretty random at this point. I think it probably has some S's in it, but I don't think it's particularly good otherwise. And I don't even think it necessarily has an S, and there's nowhere to play. I don't think that his range is particularly bingo heavy, and even if it was, I'm not going to play Arius. Arius is going to leave some really hefty bingos if his range is actually pretty strong. Meanwhile, eateries, it's really easy to block the board after eateries. I can overlap eateries, and that's going to make it really hard to extend at the top left, which is one of the quadrants I'm trying to close here. The board's really closed. This is going to be really difficult for Scott after eateries. The way that you can just control the board after eateries, especially after column K parallels, is just so good. It's just going to be really hard for him to do much, and I'm going to be a tempo ahead, and it's just going to make his life really, really difficult. So, yeah, I'm definitely already thinking about position here. I'm definitely thinking about closing the board here with a lead. Can't wait until you have ugly tiles to think about position. You have to think about it when you have good tiles and you're making the play to get your lead. Once you get the lead, you need to start thinking about how you're going to control the board and how you're going to make the board exactly how you want it. And for that reason, I think it's definitely worth sacrificing 5 points to play eateries here. Scott, Ginstty, and this is a pretty rough position. I think there's really only 2 options here. There's Fatty and there's Kitty. And he ends up playing Kitty. I think it's perfectly reasonable. Fatty's reasonable too, just because it keeps a better leave and keeps less scoring options for me. But on the other hand, you need those scoring options just to threaten it so that I don't block the K line so easily. Or if I do, then he has something back. That being said, Kitty's leave is substantially worse. The N and G definitely need an I to cover here. And even if he gets an I, it's going to be pretty hard to hit. He has to hit something ending in TING now. And it's not going to fit at the top of the board, so it's kind of rough. But it's going to be tough for Scott no matter what here. So I think Kitty with the extra points is definitely worthwhile and may serve as a distraction for me to maybe leave the board a little bit more open, which is definitely what Scott needs here. It's worth noting that the Y at 15L isn't as dangerous anymore because Y is generally inwards, and I'm not going to be wanting to play west off of the Y very often, unless it scores a lot, because I don't want to open the bottom left quadrant. The bottom left quadrant is nice and closed right now, and since I have a lead, I'm always going to try to avoid opening it, unless I can do so without opening it at all. So Kitty is better for that reason. I do think it's probably a stronger play the more I look at it. I think that Kitty's probably preferred here. Now, you might be thinking that it's worth sacrificing some points and playing Yeti, keeping a really powerful STING leave. And while that is a good leave, it's not such a good leave on this board because there's really just nowhere to play a bingo on this board. GINST is really only a good leave if there's someplace to play it, if there's someplace that you can score 60, 70, 80 points, and that's just not going to happen on this board very often. It's really obvious to your opponent that you're probably fishing, so your opponent's just going to block. They're going to probably play through the E and eateries, and you're going to have a bingo that probably isn't going to have any place to play. So for that reason, you should definitely not be playing Yeti here. You should definitely be playing either Kitty or Fatty here. So I'm up 36, and I'm in a very commanding position here. Board's pretty closed, and Scott just played off 4 tiles, and his range is pretty random. I guess it's a little bit stronger than usual. Probably has some S's in it, but other than that, not very good. I'm not too worried about his range here. Don't think it has a blank very often. And I have several options. I have Mode, I have Mute, and I have Dowry. So I think that equity-wise, in terms of valuation, the standard play would be Mode. It scores 13 more, it keeps ER. But I think Mew is stronger. DEOR is a slightly stronger leave. There's no reason for column O to go away next turn. I'm expecting to get that from Scott almost 100% of the time next turn. And I'm not going to really want to be playing there anyway. It's just not very effective, and I'm very, very close to almost complete quadrant control. And I'm going to stop a lot of bingos by playing Mew as well. Bingos that may be hard to stop later on. Especially once he starts opening up the top left, it's going to be very, very hard to close. So I want to stop it as soon as I can. Could play Dowry. I don't really want to open, the bottom left quadrant here. It's just really dangerous to do so. He could have a blank here. It's not that likely, but he still could. He could definitely have an S here. And once I open that area of the board, there's still going to be another area of the board open. It's going to just be really hard to stop him in general. And I want to be able to control the entire board. And without making a defensive play this turn, it's going to be really hard to do so. Yes, it does stop really dangerous things like big bingos along rows 14 and 15, but those are just not very likely, especially given his range. And if Scott does end up hitting those, it's going to be okay most of the time. We'll be tied, roughly. If he hits row 14, I'm going to have a big counterplay using the triple word, so it's going to be okay. I'm going to have a lead of the tempo most of the time. And I just expect this to be a really good situation for me most of the time after Mew. It'll be a really good situation for me after any play, really, but it's much more likely that I'll be able to stop all bingos and just coast here because the board's just really bad for Scott after Mew, whereas it's much easier for Scott to hit multiple bingos and come back after any other play here. So I play Mew. And it backfires very, very hard. Scott plays studying, and all of a sudden, the situation that I just described, with all the closed board and all this very hard to create any quadrants or any opening, has just applied to me instead. This is very, very bad. This is over a bingo lead on a board that is pretty much impossible to work with, and puts me in a really, really bad situation. So I have DEOOPRV, and all of a sudden things have changed dramatically, and my position is no longer very good. Column O is now a liability for me. When you have a lead, those are exactly the kinds of spots that you want to leave open. They're not going to hit anybody really, really hard, but they're a reliable place to get 35 points. I can't afford Scott to get 35 points, so even if I bingo and he takes that spot, it's still going to be me being over a bingo down, so I really want to block it if at all possible. And there's really just not a lot of other options here. If I had another option, I would certainly do so, but there's just not a lot that they can do to open the board here that's going to score, and I need to take that scoring spot out. So without that scoring spot, I might try to do something a little bit more open, but given that scoring spot's there, I had to take it, so I played roved. Scott, EINRSC blank, and he draws the last blank, and he has one of the two remaining S's, and I played 5 tiles, so my range is basically random. And he plays Zin. Not sure what I think about this. I'm not really a fan of it. I get that you want to leave the last bingo lane open, but he doesn't really need to bingo that often. And he's basically flipping over his rack here, which is a big problem when you're playing somebody who can realize what a play like Zin means, because he played Zin instead of Zit, which it's going to be relevant to the plays that I make later as well. And I think that when you make plays like Zin, when you're playing top players in general, you need to think about what your range is and what their perception of your range is. And I guess it doesn't matter that much here. But when he does this, it's just very transparent what's going on here. And when I hit row 14, which granted isn't going to be very often, it's going to hurt a lot some of the time. I think it's just a much stronger play. Even though you're not likely to bingo, you actually are likely to bingo somewhat often, because I'm not going to just leave the board like this. If a good player is down by a bingo, they're not going to leave the board in a situation where they have no way to come back. So they're going to create some sort of opening, and you can hit that instead. You don't need a bingo to win, and you can count pretty reliably that you're going to get a lane. So for that reason, I prefer Zit. I don't really want to portray my rack this way. But Scott does play Zin, and I actually pretty sure I end up swearing at this point. This is a very, very bad situation. A whole host of reasons. I have AIILOPQ, and now I need to start thinking about, well, how does this affect my entire game and tournament situation? So looking at the standings, spread is very important to me at this record and at these spreads. My spread is going to end up mattering for placement a lot, especially if I want to win the tournament. I need to stay ahead of Nigel in spread. That is very, very important. And because of this, I want to conserve spread very, very much. I think it's pretty reliable that when Scott plays Zin, especially using the last N that's out, that he has the blank nearly 100% of the time. And maybe not just a blank, but probably a good set of tiles to go with it. I think he has an S fairly often. I think he has an E fairly often. I just think that his range is just smashing this board. I don't think that I'm going to win this game very often at all. So I think that you need to start cutting spread here. Now, if I want to win this game, you can make a case for a lot of different options. Something like Lima that opens the board. Something like even exchanging and trying to hit something like Pirok on row 14, which is really a large percentage of the way that I'm going to win this game. That's how dire this situation is. I can hit 130-point plays, but, that's the only way because Scott's going to have all these different options to come back afterwards. So I don't really like my options all that much, and I'm perfectly happy if this score just stays what it is right now. I'm down by 80 points. If I can end up with an 80-point loss, given the range that Scott's portrayed with this rack, I will be very happy. So for that reason, I play QI, and normally you wouldn't want to play QI because you're blocking row 14, but for me in this case, blocking row 14 is an asset. I'm up against a stupid strong range here, and because of that, I feel very much like I'm just dead. And yeah, it depends on a lot of things too. The fact that it's the last end, the fact that Scott played Zin very quickly, meant to me that just his range is just never an average range here. It's never even just ARSL or something like that. He never just has average tiles here. He always has it. When he takes Zin in the amount of time that he took Zin at this score against this player, I just don't think he ever doesn't tap the blank here, and probably a really strong range at that. So I play QI. Scott has drawn vowels, so he doesn't get a bingo down. I did block his bingo. Scott's in a position too where he also doesn't need spread that much. If you look at his record and his standings at this point, he's actually got a very weak spread, which is the opposite of me. I have a spread that's good, but not good enough to be comfortable with. Scott has a spread that's so bad that he's not going to catch any of the leaders. So I think he should be playing a little bit more conservative here. Being said, it's going to be very hard for me to win this game, especially now, and there's no reason to open the board anymore. At this point, I said that I would take an 80-point win. I think Scott would take an 80-point win here as well. I think this is one of those situations where both players have something similar in interest. So even though Scott's range is way stronger than me, he has also both of the last E's in this case. So he has one S, he has the only blank, and he has both the last E's. It's just going to be almost impossible for me to win here. So there's no reason to play anything aggressive whatsoever. Because those are both the last two E's, I think that you should be keeping both of them. So for that reason, I think 2 is fine. I think this is a fine option. I don't see anything wrong with it. There are other options. You can play toe, and you can do something more blocky to block, or row 3 options or something like that. But I think this is a fine option. I think that 2 is just fine. I have AAILOOP, and this is actually a very, very good draw for what I have here. I have no reason whatsoever to believe that Scott has the C here. And even though I want to cut spread, I think that there is some hope in playing Oppo here and trying to draw the C. I think there's some chance that I will win this game, and it's certainly a lot stronger than it looked last turn. I was completely ready to just cut spread and bail and just say, okay, I've lost this game. But now that you can hit a tile, that really isn't in Scott's range all that much, I think this is a much better option. I think that this actually leads to winning off of very fluky C draws some of the time. Even though this does probably lose more often, if Scott has a C, I'm probably going to lose this game by a lot. I don't think that Scott has very many C's here. I think he would have played it off last turn a lot of the time. There's a lot of decent C options. Yeah, I just don't think he has C's very much at all, so I think this is a perfectly good play. Once in a while, you're going to draw the C, you're going to have ACILO, and you're going to bingo some of the time. And you're going to have a long shot chance. You'll still be an underdog, even if you hit a C bingo. But it's a chance. And whenever you have a chance to win the game, you pretty much have to take it. So I played Oppo here. Again, I think that this is a little bit risky because spread is just so useful here. But given my other options, things like poi and stuff like that, I just think that this is the best line. I think it's going to win just often enough that it's worth the risk and spread. And even if I draw the C and I don't end up bingoing, it's still going to be good for me in the long run. Scott doesn't have the C. He still has a good rack, though. He has EEIRSS blank. And this is how bad the board is, that he can't even bingo with this rack and isn't even really all that close. Now, he can just score, ends up playing ERS, it scores well, and he's not really in much danger of losing this game. Even if I have the C, there's actually very, very few bingos that I can hit given this pool. But there's maybe 5 bingos that hit in row 2, and even if I hit a row 2 bingo, he's still going to win this game probably 80% of the time or something like that, just because he has the blank and he is so strong of options. And I'm going to have to open up some scoring opportunities. That being said, I do probably still prefer C in row 2 just to block that, because a lot of the times I'm going to have the C already. He doesn't know that I don't have the C, and some of the time I'm going to have something like ARIC or something like that, and I'll hit some bingos some of the time. And again, he doesn't really need spread. He doesn't need to take that sort of risk. So I do prefer C a little bit just to stop some of the miracle shots, but this outruns most of the miracle shots. This is going to win plenty of games too. So I don't draw the C, and I make what I think is pretty much a pretty bad blunder here. I'm down by 77, and I'm back in the situation where I was before. I need to draw a bingo to win the game, and I need to draw a C to even think about winning the game. And there's 7 tiles in the bag. But given all that I said about the blank being out and all of that sort of thing, I think I need to go back to the entire notion of, well, I'm not going to win this game. This is kind of a difficult play because I still have no reason to believe Scott has the C, although I think it's a little bit more likely now because he left the hook open, and why would he leave the hook open if he doesn't have it? Then again, he can outrun a lot of the time, and there's a lot of times when, even if he has the C, he either has to just drop the C, or he's just not going to have any good options, and blocking the C is going to be kind of difficult with a lot of racks, so I guess it's possible he could leave it open. He does have SEE, though, so I don't know. And he has SER, too, so it's not like he's blocking some miracle row 3 shot. I do have some history with Scott. Maybe about 5 years before this, I thought about fishing for a 9, and I didn't. And Scott ended up not blocking a 9 that was in the bag. And he said he didn't know at the time as Olivenite, but I do remember that, and that thought alone made me think, well, maybe it's a little bit more likely as a C, because I thought that maybe that Scott wouldn't think as much as he should about long shot chances. So because he didn't think about a live a nine, he didn't think about nines in that situation in that game about 6 or 7 years ago, but I still remember it. I thought that he was a little bit more likely to disregard the C or just disregard the thought that Appel was being cooked at all. He also did miss a hook in another game that I played against him, and ended up costing him quite a bit. So I thought that there was enough of a chance that he didn't have a C because of those things. Also, even if he does have the C, it's going to be really hard for me to do anything about it. So between all of those things, my options being kind of bad, I thought that it was probably worthwhile to go ahead and fish for the C and try to bingo and try to win this game. But I ain't winning this game very often down 77, even if I hit the bingo. And when you actually look at the pool and look at how many bingos I can hit, there aren't a lot of them if you assume that Scott has the blank. And I definitely, at this point, still think Scott has the blank. So I could definitely do something like exchange 4 and try to hit specific bingos. Things like Illogic or Abulik or something like that. I could play Raj even and then to draw BC. But even if I do that, I'm not winning the game. I think I was just thinking the wrong thing. I was thinking about trying to win the game, where in reality, I should be thinking about how to avoid getting destroyed this game. Even though I think my exchange is reasonable here because I need to get the C, I did it for all the wrong reasons, and that definitely is an error. Even if you make the right play for the wrong reasons, that's still something that you need to think about and you need to correct in your game. I think in hindsight, I would have kept the A here. I may have kept like AR or AIR if I exchanged. And maybe I would just play through this rack somehow. Maybe something like out or something like that would also be reasonable. But yeah, I don't like my play here. I definitely don't like my thought process here. My thought process was, well, I need to hit the C. And maybe there's some really, really long shot that I'll hit the blank or something. But I'm not going to win this game. I shouldn't try to win this game. I need to cut spread. And that's something that you need to think about a lot of the time. And I just tried a little bit too hard to win the game that really just wasn't winnable. So yeah, I exchanged 6 here, just trying to get the C, hoping that the blank was still out. I don't know what evidence I would have of that. Maybe he had something like duplicate ERS, ES, something like that. Maybe that swayed me a little bit to think, well, maybe I'm just wrong and that he doesn't have the blank. But after Zen, he has the blank. Scott's a good player. He has to have the blank here. Definitely think I should keep some vowels here, at least 1, hopefully 2. So AR or ARI is much better, I think, just to try to get some sort of semblance of staying in the game. Or just playing out and just getting through it and hoping that he hasn't hit a C bingo. Scott, CEISUV blank. So he actually draws the C here, which is interesting. Again, Scott doesn't really need spread that badly, so he doesn't need to keep the C. And his other options aren't that good. He can play this, I guess, and keep the C. He can exchange VU. Or he can just block the C and play servo. I would guess that all of these plays at this point win the game nearly 100% of the time, if not 100% of the time. I have literally no hope with this bag. And I'm not going to be able to open anything. And if I do, I'm going to get punished by the S in the blank very hard. And I'm not going to. And I think Scott knows that I'm not going to at this point, especially after I play QI. So he just takes the points. I think he's just trying to win by as much as possible at this point and not risk the game. And I certainly respect that. I think it's reasonable. Being said, I think that exchanging VU is probably a little bit better here because I'm not going to be able to block the hook that easily. And even if I do, I'm going to have to open up something else. And the pool is awful, and he's just going to hit so many bingos so often that I think it's a reasonable play. That being said, I don't blame him for this at all. This is a play that wins 100% of the time, and spread's not that important to him. So I'm not sure he actually thought about it that much. I actually don't think he did. I think he just said, okay, this wins the game, and then just played, which makes a lot of sense. So at this point, this is all just spread. I think that this game is considerably over. I don't draw the C. I assume that Scott had it the whole time. Actually a bit confused why he played servo. From my point of view, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but, it doesn't really matter at this point. I have GILLORW. I'm just trying to cut spread, and I'm just looking for options, and I don't see a lot, and there really aren't a lot. At this point, I'm just thinking about, okay, well, what are the spots that I can use that he is going to want to use? And I see a lot of vowels in the bag, and I'm like, okay, well, SIR is going to scores as much as I can score this turn, and he's going to want to use it himself, so I should play there. And hopefully cut spread a little bit. And maybe draw something a little bit better to neutralize the options and just hopefully stop him from bingoing on future turns. There really aren't a lot of decent alternatives either. There's low, there's WO, there's just not a lot of places to score. I definitely want to both score points and deprive him of using that as a cheap way to scoring points. I'm just trying to, just hold this deficit to 100 because the spread's really important to me, so I definitely want to keep as much spread as possible. Scott, BCE, IOU blank. not a lot of good options. There's not really any places to use the C or the B for any good points here, and he does want to balance. He's probably hoping I'm going to open the board. I think he knows inside that it's not really going to happen, but he has to try, and he wants to keep that as an option. And if he plays off one tile here, even if I open the board, he's never going to get to bingo. So he just goes with out here. Seems perfectly fine. Scores 10 points, which is not bad on this board. Sticks me with the G, makes it a lot harder for the G to be played here, and just keeps himself more flexible no matter what he draws. So I think that's perfectly fine. I don't think there's really any other options here. I draw another L. Not very good. I just take the points here. I don't really want to do anything that's too jeopardizing too much here, and 3 L's is going to be very cumbersome, especially if he does some sort of opening play here. Anything else is too risky. It's too likely he has a U here, so I don't want to play llamas, although I think it's okay, because I don't think he has that many U's in his range. I don't think that he kept 2 U's after servo, and I think that a decent percentage of the time he used his last U to play out, so I think it might be okay to play, but there's just too many different options. If he has the U, it's going to hurt a little bit. I probably didn't think enough about how many bingos there are. It's really not any bingos on row 2, but I still don't want to play llamas. I think it's low is a lot more standard, and I can always set up llamas if he gets rid of his U, or better yet, gets rid of his blank. So I want to keep that as an option, and I want to keep gammas as an option, so for that reason I played low. A, B, C, E, I, U, blank. Again, he wants to deprive the G, so he plays caper. It does force me to play gammas if I want to use the G, at least seemingly at this point. So I think that's a reasonable play. Gaper also scores better, so this is one of those times when you're just looking at different spots and you're trying to use spots where your opponent wants to use those spots. You want to take the spots that you have in common, and you want to take the ones that are better for you first. And the C is going to be really hard for you to use, and the G is going to be really hard for me to use, so because of that he played caper and got rid of the C. And now we're in an endgame. This is a pretty complicated situation and a pretty complicated endgame because there's a blank involved, and it's a trap endgame. There's a lot of tiles that are very close to not being able to be used. Again, I have the G, and he has the U. That's going to be really difficult to use, and I need to get rid of all these tiles, and I need to stop him from setting stuff up. So for me, there are 2 spots that are really useful and important to think about. There's the lair spot at C9, and there's the llama spot and the gamma spot at I3. And I need to keep both of those options open, and I can't use either of them yet. Problem with the lair spot is that he can make lairs, and I'm not going to be able to do very much there, and he can just wait and just do it whenever he wants to. And he also has the hooks for that. He's going to score a lot of points there, I just can't do that yet. So because of that, I play whoa. The other thing is that the W, as good as the W is for short plays, there are no short plays there, and if I don't use the W now, I could get stuck with it very easily. It's not something that's easy to see or automatic, but it's definitely a problem. Actually, now that I think about it more, I think he should probably be playing con just because of the W. I think that if he plays con, I'm going to probably be stuck with the W. Maybe not stuck with the W, but I'd be stuck playing the W in a really undesirable way. Something like WOG at I1, which would leave very, very expensive overlaps in response. So, yeah, I think that actually he should have played con instead of playing caper, but that's another issue anyway. I need to get rid of the W, and I actually want to get rid of the O. All I want to do is keep GILR in my rack so that I'm not committed to playing either rig or the llama spot, which can get punished very hard, or playing lair, which can also get punished very hard. I want to keep both of those options possible until he commits to one or the other, and either spends his blank or puts himself in a situation such that setups are much more difficult and that I can choose one or the other. So because of that, I end up playing whoa. Scott, AABEIU blank, and he's just trying to stall. He's in the exact opposite situation. He wants to make me commit to an option so that he can punish that option. Ideally, I play something like rig, and then he can play something on row 1, or something like that. So he plays the A off. I think there's lots of different options. I think I prefer playing the U off a little bit, just because it's so hard to play the U off. But he does want to keep the U for some Ulamas options, I guess, and some BEAU options. So that if I do play gammas, he can play agamas and BEAU. So I guess that's why he wants to keep the U. But I think that it's difficult to do that effectively, because he's going to be stuck in the same situation next turn a lot of the time. But I do understand why he's doing this. He's trying to get me to commit to an option. He's trying to keep his options as flexible as possible. So for that reason, he plays Ran. I have Grill on my rack, and I play LI. Again, I want to keep Lair, and I want to keep the column 1 options. At this point, Llamas isn't going to happen. He has the U in his rack, so there's no way that I can ever play that. The main reason why I play LI here instead of playing LO is that I want to keep the GO spot open. I want options for the G, and I want him to have to use the B to block it if he's going to block it. If he uses the B to block it, then I can play Rig up top, and then he's not going to have any good scoring options on row 1. He needs to keep the B. So because of that, I want to keep the G having as many options as possible, and GI is not a word at this point. Plus, GO just scores more than GI does anyways, and that's a net 1 point for me. So I'm going to score 1 more point by doing this. I just want to make him use the B if he's going to block me. So Scott goes ahead and plays Llamas himself here. He has a lot of different options he can do here. The idea is that he can play Llamas and then he can play EAU, but I have the L, so I'm going to be able to block this. He still can't play Gammas, by the way, with the blank G. I'm going to be able to play Ig, and then I'm going to be able to play Lair, and he can't really block Lair once he uses the blank. So he's stuck in a position between a rock and a hard place here. He can't stall anymore, because if I play Rig over there, he's going to be able to play, and I'm going to have 2 spots at the L, and he's not going to have anything good to play over there. And there's no good places to use the I or the U. There's no places at all to use the I or the U, so he can't even go out when he's playing that, and he can't stall, so he has to play something like this. This is actually pretty reasonable, not because he gets EAU down very often, but because his options are just really bad at this point. So he has to do something, and it's not the best, but it's one of many, many bad options here. I don't actually have a lot of good options here either, and my goal is, if I'm going to get stuck, I want him to get stuck too. So I only really have 3 options here. I can either drop the L, or I can drop LI, or I can play somewhere else and just play off GO or Lair or something like that. Ultimately, I end up going with LI. Even if he blocks, he's going to be in some trouble here. Benefit of LI is that after LI, he's going to be stuck with tiles himself, probably. He's going to be stuck with the U, or he's going to just be in a really, really bad situation trying to get rid of all of his tiles. Yes, I am going to get stuck with G2 a lot of the time. He's going to drop BO, and I'm going to have no spots, because GI is still not a word. But if he does that, then he's going to get stuck himself. He's going to get in a situation where his U's not going to play. Or if his U did play, he'd allow me to play the G. I would have to end up passing, but I could certainly figure that out. What he's hoping for is something where I pass and put myself in a situation where he can maneuver his way to set up his U and be able to play it or something like that. But I'm not going to let that happen, obviously. So AEBIU, he needs to get rid of his tiles, and I think he realizes that if he plays BO, that he's going to get stuck. So in this case, he just tries to put himself in a situation where he doesn't get stuck. So because of that, he plays BI and just lets me have GO. He's also in time trouble at this point, I think. Don't really remember the game super well, but I think that that's also an issue here. But yeah, he plays BI. I play my G in the only spot possible, and he's still U stuck, by the way. He can't block ER, so he just takes as many points as he can, plays AE, and then I play Ray out, and I lose the game by 87. Which is my goal for the last 2/3 of this game, so I'm pretty happy about that. And I think Scott's okay with that too, by the way, again, because of his spread situation. But anyway, this is a very interesting game with a lot of very technical decisions, and I hope you learned a lot. If you have any questions, again, let me know in the comments or something. I'll try my best to answer as many of these as I can. Until next time.